government. I must say, given what's on TV now, those of you interested in public policy, this is a very fine turnout. And that's because the topic is so important and because our speaker knows a huge amount about this area. You may have noticed that Crawford has changed a little bit in the last few months. That is, we have a splendid new wonderful building and a terrific lecture theatre which you're in. One of the changes that's happened to Crawford that is not so visible, but I think even more important than our physical environment, is that two other groups from the ANU joined us over the last few months, the group RMAP and the Source Management in Asia Pacific, and the economists from the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies. I think these are very important, significant, positive changes for Crawford. And today's talk was given by Frank Jotzo, who came from RMAP, but is now embedded, I think, happily in Crawford. Frank is an economist. He started working on climate change well before climate change issues became an important topic for public debate, particularly in Australia. And he's Deputy Director from the Climate Change Institute as well as part of Crawford. He's worked very closely in direct policy context to do with climate change. He worked for the Ghana Review. He's worked for the World Bank and the Indonesian Ministry of Finance. I can't think of a more important topic than climate change policy for public sector engagement, and I think we'll have an extraordinary talk from somebody who really knows what's going on, not just conceptually in a research context, but the way that policy works. So please welcome Frank Jotzo.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Bruce, to set the bar very high. I'll endeavour to make the jump. Now, this talk today is about an evaluation and an analysis of the targets and pledges and commitments that various countries have put forward as part of the Copenhagen climate change negotiations and in the aftermath of these negotiations in December. It has an immediate relevance and importance for Australia because Australia's target commitment is framed in terms of a range of targets, depending on what other countries do. And there's some very specific conditions that the government set out last year and has in fact reiterated in the submission to the Copenhagen Accord. And one purpose in doing this quantitative comparison of countries' targets is to get a fix on whether or not and to what extent those conditions for a stricter Australian target are in fact fulfilled. Now, Copenhagen Accord, I've just pasted a couple of what I would say are the key phrases in there. The 2-degree target is acknowledged, that is an ambition to keep temperature increases in the long term to a threshold of 2 degrees. That is a pretty ambitious goal, but certainly one that the science is telling us is a kind of imperative to limit the risk of dangerous climate change. And then the question of peaking, because 2 degrees means that global greenhouse gas emissions will have to be reduced drastically from current levels, but currently the trend is still a rise every year, even during the recession global emissions rose. In the original text, before it was agreed, there was actually some dates for a peaking date for global emissions that was being aimed for, that did not find its way into the final version of the Accord, but nevertheless the notion of global emissions peaking and then by implication coming down is in there. We now have over 100 countries who have submitted either a commitment to limit or reduce their emissions intensity or other measures, and a list of actions of what countries will do to achieve their emissions pledges. And those 100 countries account for just over 80% of current global greenhouse emissions. So it's not bad. Also financing, there's a commitment in the Copenhagen Accord that rich countries will provide startup financing of $30 billion to developing countries over the space of 3 years, starting immediately from 2012, with the prospect of that being ramped up to $100 billion a year by 2020, plus the prospect of carbon market finance, but that very much depends on individual countries' mitigation frameworks, market rules, and what comes out of the future UNFCCC negotiation process, including the upcoming negotiations at the end of the year in Mexico. Quick summary of the target pledges of the countries that are in this analysis that I've done. I should add, some of you have a printout of about 5-6 pages with lots and lots of numbers in it. These are the kind of all the gory detail of the background numbers that underlie this analysis. I only bought a limited number of copies, but I'm very, very happy to share that with you. Please just send me an email. I'll send that to you by email. And over the next week or so, I'll be finalizing the paper. The paper will be available on the Environmental Economics Research Hub website. Developed countries have absolute emission reduction targets, different base years and different percentage reductions targeted there. China and India have emissions intensity targets, that is, targets to reduce the amount of carbon per unit of GDP in those countries. And most developing countries that have taken on the quantitative commitment have done so in the form of a reduction commitment relative to business as usual, relative to a trajectory that is deemed to have been the case if nothing had been done. So first of all, to show you what we're doing here is the main actual analytical work is to put all of these different targets onto a common footing and thereby achieve a measure of comparability. Because if you just look at the targets as they come out of Copenhagen Accord, you really can't compare them. Really apples, oranges, and peaches all mixed together. I'm doing this across 4 dimensions: reductions, absolute emissions, emissions intensity, per capita emissions, and relative to business as usual. I will then speak briefly about the prospects for individual countries actually meeting those targets, and about what I think it implies for Australia's Copenhagen commitment. But I'll try and keep those last 2 points short, because that may well be what we'll want to take up in the discussion. First of all, absolute emissions reductions. As you will see in just a second, there are very large differences in the percentage reductions targeted by individual countries, reflecting very large differences in the underlying growth momentum that apply in different countries, and also reflecting very different levels of development between countries. Different base years that countries have adopted for their commitments matter greatly. Again, I'll show that in a second. A word on the aggregate ambition of the targets coming out of Copenhagen. It's not really what the paper is about, but nevertheless an issue that needs to be addressed. The widespread view, or the mainstream view, and one that is coming out of many other analyses, is that what has been pledged is not on track towards the so-called 450 ppm scenario, or in fact a 2-degree scenario. Most analyses that show a possible trajectory towards 2 degrees or towards 450 have 2020 aggregate emissions at a level a fair bit lower than what is implicit in the Copenhagen targets. Nevertheless, it's actually not possible to make firm judgments about this, because this is a much longer term issue than just the next 10 years. Right? Whether 2 degrees or an equal chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees will be met or not is not just determined in the next 10 years. Right? You can have overshooting scenarios where not a lot is done until 2020, but then some very drastic action to mitigate it. Absolute emission changes. This is putting the developed country pledges onto a common base year, 2005. You can see here the dark blue is the kind of lower target, the light blue is the larger one. So Australia ranges between -10 and -30 or thereabouts. This is because we're using 2005 as a common base year rather than 2000, and emissions grew between the year 2000 and 2005. Okay? So that's the impact of the base year that we have here. The differences are not too great between developed countries, with the exception of Russia, which in fact has a growth target if you use the year 2005 as a baseline. Russia has framed their reduction commitment relative to the year 1990, when the socialist economy was still pumping it out at a rate of knots. Absolute emissions targeted change for all countries. This is what I mean by stark differences. Okay? So China and India, you have a targeted strong increase in absolute emissions. Blue bar is a so-called central scenario. Red and green bars are high and low sensitivity analysis around that, and I'm happy to go into detail about that if you're just interested in discussing that. Interestingly, many of the developing countries may actually end up with a reduction in absolute emissions between 2005 and 2020. If you look at the aggregates for Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, and this refers just to the countries that I've got in my analysis here, not all of the countries combined. You've got a slight reduction for Annex 1 overall, that's the developed countries, and an increase for non-Annex 1 overall. Framing the targets for different base years. In aggregate, it doesn't make much difference whether you frame the reductions relative to 1990, 2000, 2005, but it makes a huge difference for individual countries. So for Australia, for instance, no difference between 1990 and 2000 because aggregate emissions were about the same, but a sizable difference up to 2005. Huge difference for Russia and other Eastern European countries because emissions went down by so much in the 1990s. And a fair bit of difference, or large difference, for the US as well. And you can see here very clearly why the US would have chosen a 2005 base year rather than a 1990 base year, because the 17% reduction target relative to 2005 translates into an only 3% reduction target relative to 1990. So framing matters. Again, the same comparison for all countries in the analysis, and these differences are really, really stark for the fast-growing developing countries. Okay. So if you wanted to take it back to a 1990 base year, then you would be saying, well, the Chinese target implies a 2.5-fold increase, or ranking it up to 3.5 times 1990 emissions. So developing countries, in my opinion, quite rightfully say, why would you possibly choose 1990 as a base year when it is now 2010 and we're about to now actually take some action on the issue? So I think there's actually quite good arguments for using a 2005 base. When you use that, then the absolute emissions increases in some of these developing countries implicit in the targets are nowhere near as much. Emissions intensity. Now, as I said, China's and India's targets are framed as a decrease in emissions intensity between 2005 and 2020. So what we're talking about is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of local currency over time. You can argue that this is actually a very useful measure because it takes out GDP out of the equation. GDP is not normally considered a policy variable. Okay? We're not inducing a global financial crisis in order to put a dampener on CO2 out. Okay? So might as well take GDP out and look at the underlying factors, that is structural change and energy efficiency and energy mix. Those are the things that affect emissions intensity. And what you see coming out from the quantitative analysis is that the targeted emissions intensity reductions across countries are actually remarkably similar. Okay? So you don't have a big difference between the targeted reductions in developing countries and developed countries. Most countries are around about the minus 40% mark over 50 years. Right? So something like, what is that? 2.5% a year or thereabouts. Okay, that's the targeted reduction. Then the question, of course, becomes who will find it harder to achieve a 2.5% per year reduction in the ratio of emissions per GDP? Answer probably is that the rich countries and the more efficient countries will find it harder to make those gains. Okay? First of all, because you don't grow as fast and you don't have as much opportunity to put in new capital stock. You will have to achieve more by replacing existing capital stock, and the existing capital stock that you replace with more efficient machinery or equipment, the gain that you get from that is also not as large because the existing capital stock is already more efficient than what's in existence in developing countries. But nevertheless, if you accept emissions intensity as a useful measure of comparison, then you get this kind of picture with developing country targets typically on par or even exceeding developed countries' pledges. Now, comparison to business as usual. This is a difficult thing. Most developing country targets are framed as business as usual reductions, but many of the developing countries haven't actually defined the business as usual trajectory. Okay? So you just put a number for a relative reduction, but you don't put the absolute starting point and you don't have anything much. All you then have is a sense that there has been a significant pledge made for action. But you really can't work on the numbers much. So in that situation, what I did was to construct business as usual scenarios based on existing analysis and what I hope to be some judgment. Reduction relative to business as usual is a measure of the effect of action, but it's quite an elusive concept. Okay? So it's what would have been the case in the future if it hadn't been for the dedicated action that we'll take. And it's a counterfactual. Often this is mistaken or confused with projections of likely outcomes. And to my reading, that's what's been happening with the China debate, where many observers have been saying China's emissions target is just business as usual, because China's emissions target is quite similar to the International Energy Agency's reference case. Now, the IEA reference case includes a continuation of policies that China has put in place and has announced, okay? Which, for the most part, are very ambitious policies, such as the energy intensity reduction target between 2005 and 2010. Okay? Just means that they'll have to keep doing a lot. Okay? So there's a lot of confusion around that. My business as usual case here is a business as usual case where you don't do anything to reduce carbon intensity and carbon emissions. Okay? Quantitative estimates are, of course, contestable. Okay? These are assumptions that they're making about different variables, and we cannot be sure that this is, of course, right. But I think the magnitudes are so large that a qualitative argument certainly emerges from it. Perhaps the lesson that comes out of it is, again, that reduction relative to business as usual quite similar across countries, and that, in fact, very large reductions relative to BAU would come out of China. This is something that comes out of a current analysis that David Stern and I did together, and the paper for that, the full paper, was just released today. And there's a few copies floating around here as well. And it also confirms something that we said in analysis for the Gamma review together with Stephen a couple of years ago. Okay, here we're comparing the target in absolute change from 2005 to 2020, same numbers as in the very first slide or set of slides, compared to my business as usual projection, the middle scenario. Okay? In the following slides I'll have low and high scenarios as well. The difference between the two is the reduction that is implicit in the target. Okay? So a bit of a mixed bag, really, but for most countries, except India in this analysis, there is a substantial difference between the target and the business as usual trajectory. Of course, for the developing countries here on the right, this is so by definition because the targets are framed in terms of business as usual deviation. So we know what the business as usual deviation is meant to be. It's just what the target is written as the. Now, this is just measuring the difference between the two bars. Okay? Difference in percentage points at 2020 between the target and the business as usual trajectory. Okay? So again, we've got the majority of countries in the middle scenario, sort of between 20 and 30% relative to business as usual. Okay? To me, that was striking that we actually have the developing countries in a very similar range as the developed countries. Now, looking at this in absolute terms, how many gigatons, how many megatons of emission savings are we likely to get out of this? Again, the three scenarios, low, high, and middle. Look at the blue one as the central one. My analysis says that up to or around 2/3 of the total absolute emissions reduction relative to business as usual would be achieved in developing countries. Now, some of that would be achieved with direct financial assistance from developed countries, perhaps involving emissions trading between countries as well. But nevertheless, okay, under the Copenhagen pledges, and if countries actually go through with this, and if our assumptions about what would have been the case if it hadn't been for the action are right, we get this kind of picture, 2/3 in developing countries. If you break it down by countries, then you see where the bulk comes from, it's China. Okay? Now that's of course a reflection that China, under business as usual, would account for a very large share of global emissions. Okay? Probably something like twice or more of the US by 2020, or thereabouts. Final quantitative comparison I've got here is per capita. Countries obviously differ greatly in their level of development, differ greatly also in their carbon output per person. Developing countries make the argument that they need headway in development. And for a long time coming, they may need to increase their carbon output even per person if they're putting in the infrastructure that already exists in developed countries. Now, there's a very important concept around per capita measurements, and that's the contraction and convergence model, okay? Which is a principle for slicing up the remaining space in the atmosphere along the lines of arriving at a common per capita emissions output, or at least a common per capita emissions allocation in the medium to long term. And again, this is model used in the Garlow review. There's a lot of argument about what might be the proper convergence state, but you don't really get around the conclusion that in the long term, there's no good argument for emissions allocations between countries to differ greatly in per capita terms. Why should Australia be allowed an emissions entitlement of 10 tonnes per person, where currently it's 25 thereabouts, when India is perhaps would have to be at 1 tonne per person to make up for the difference. In the long term, probably have to be the same. And if you wanted to reach those ambitious climate mitigation targets, a lot lower than it currently is. Now, interesting thing from this analysis, the Copenhagen targets actually imply a reduction in per capita emissions, even in many of the developing countries. Not in all of them, but in many of the developing countries. Here is the, yeah, that's right, that's what you can see. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to see from this graph. The purple one is 2005 emissions levels per person in all of these countries. You can see it differs greatly. And the green bar is the targeted 2020 per capita emissions level using UN population growth projections. Okay, so you can see reductions in all of the developed countries, again, except Russia. But of course, Russia would argue that you use 1990 as a basis and you have a reduction. You've got an increase in China and in India, but you have a decrease, a strong decrease, in fact, in Indonesia and Brazil. The reason there being that the bulk of their emissions are from deforestation, and the baseline there is probably for constant emissions level, and the target is to bring those down quite substantially, which then, of course, gives you a reduction in per capita emission levels as well. But also reductions in per capita emission levels in countries like South Africa and in newly industrialized countries like Mexico and South Korea. Can't really call South Korea a developed country, but it's a it's one country and treated as a non-developed country under the UNFCCC. Will the targets be achieved and how? Well, the answer from technical analysis is typically yes, it can be done. Technically, it can be done between now and 2020, not really a problem. The answer from economic analysis usually is it can be done at moderate cost, okay? A cost that amounts to a fraction, typically a small fraction, of expected GDP increase between now and 2020. However, the political hurdles are obviously very high, as we've seen in Australia, as we've seen in other countries. I think the Copenhagen pledges actually go some way towards addressing the perpetual free rider problem, because you're now in a situation where lots of countries have actually put on the table their individual commitment, but the free rider problem isn't out of the world, of course, because we don't know whether countries will actually follow through with it. Just a few words about a few countries. China target will require strong policies. Will it happen? It has to be a question mark over it. My sense from talking to researchers and policymakers in China is that there's a strong dedication to follow through with this target, but not necessarily a clearly worked out blueprint of how to do it. And that then, of course, raises the question, what policies will actually be implemented to reach the target? Will there be policies that are economically efficient and socially equitable? That's certainly something that remains to be seen. United States, I guess Obama had a big win with health just yesterday, and that, I suppose, augurs well to the climate change agenda, which might be the next cab off the rank. Nevertheless, I would say the likelihood is for an outcome to see a hodgepodge of policies in the US, with some measures at the federal level, not necessarily pervasive emissions pricing, but support for different kinds of low carbon energy, different types of policy regimes, including pricing and trading regimes at the state level, what happened at the municipal level as well. Indonesia, Brazil and others, big challenges to reduce deforestation. Technically, economically, that shouldn't be such a big problem, but it certainly is a very large problem institutionally and to an extent socially as well. Finishing up with just a few words of what I feel the implications are for Australia's Copenhagen commitment. Government has announced that for now, Australia is sticking with the lower end of the target range, that is 5% reduction relative to 2000, rather than 15 or 25. I would argue that a notching up of that commitment is justified. And I will also argue that the national commitment can and needs to include other issues. Firstly, financing for developing countries at large scale. And also a big opportunity, actually, to enter additional non-binding commitments on doing a lot about land-based carbon, soil sequestration, peat fires in Indonesia. It's difficult to quantify the effect, but Australia can make a credible commitment, actually try and do a lot of these things, and just see how it comes out. In terms of the formal conditions for Australia's target, this is how they're framed. 25% reduction if the world agrees to an ambitious global deal capable of stabilizing at 450. Well, like I said in the beginning, the mainstream view is that the Copenhagen targets are not really on the way there. And you can sort of give a qualitative assessment along the lines of 450 really requires fundamental change in the way the carbon-producing parts of the economy are organized. Okay? Fundamental technological change.